In the 1990s, there were few other directors working in Hollywood as famous as Steven Spielberg, from creating the first true Hollywood blockbuster with Jaws, to capturing the hearts of audiences with E.T., as well as helming the iconic Indiana Jones franchise. Almost everything he touched turned into box office gold. So when it was announced that he was taking on the beloved story of Peter Pan, filled with an all-star cast and a massive budget, it seemed like a classic in the making. But sometimes not everything goes according to plan, and this is the history of Steven Spielberg's Hook. The story begins in the 1950s, when a very young Steven Spielberg directed a theater production at his elementary school, a shortened version of Peter and Wendy, or Peter Pan and Wendy, by J.M. Barrie. This was one of Spielberg's favorite books as a child, and was often read to him by his mother as a bedtime story. In fact, unlike most kids in the early 50s, his first time seeing someone fly wasn't on the Adventures of Superman television series. It wasn't even within a comic book. It was Disney's animated film Peter Pan, and unbeknownst to him at the time, the act of flying would have a major influence on his future. In many ways, Spielberg saw himself as Peter Pan, a boy who never wanted to grow up and who never wanted to lose his imagination and who was obsessed with make-believe. So once he chose to pursue a career as a filmmaker, the decision came as a surprise to no one who knew him as a child.
Steven Spielberg is making movies and a fortune while he's still growing up. And he's really just a big kid. Is that how you see yourself? Is that a reasonable comment?
I think it's reasonable. I mean, we have to understand, how do you define a big kid?
By the 1980s, Steven Spielberg had proved himself as one of the most influential and successful directors in Hollywood history, producing hit after hit after hit. Part of the key to his success was a refusal to abandon his inner child and sense of imagination, which is why so many of his movies focused on adventure, places beyond the stars, and of course flying. But then came the incredibly controversial prequel to Raiders of the Lost Ark, Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom.
I've got some good news and I've got some bad news.
The problem wasn't so much as the critical reception, although the reaction was far less enthusiastic than Raiders. It was the incredibly dark tone and graphic violence within the PG-rated film. The backlash was so severe that this, alongside the also controversial PG-rated film Gremlins, is what led to the creation of the PG-13 rating. The suggestion for the new rating was actually from Steven Spielberg himself, and the controversy would have a lasting impact on his approach to violence in future films. But for his next movie, he would take on one of the biggest criticisms of Temple of Doom, that he'd abandoned the innocence of his earlier movies. He would do this by adapting his favorite childhood book, Peter Pan and Wendy. The initial intention was to stay very faithful to the original source material, with the 1924 silent film adaptation also providing much of the inspiration, although it more than likely would have featured a much more realistic crocodile. It was also written as a musical, with the king of pop Michael Jackson to play the iconic role of Peter Pan. At least that was the rumor that refused to die. It's clear that he desperately wanted the part and was practically begging Steven Spielberg, but while countless publications said he was signed on to the film, Spielberg consistently denied he was ever even a consideration.
If I only had a brain, I would have figured that out a long time ago.
However, for the villainous Captain Hook, the award-winning Dustin Hoffman was signed on to the film and took the role because he had always wanted to make a movie for his kids. By late 1984, pre-production on Steven Spielberg's Peter Pan was going full speed ahead, with filming set to begin the next year.
Would you say there's a sense in which E.T. is some sort of plea for a permanent childhood?
Part of it is me, calling out, saying to myself, I'm 34 years old, I'm not married, I don't have kids. Is this going to be my last summer vacation before I have to be a responsible adult?
Just a few months before filming was to begin in London, a life-changing event happened to Steven Spielberg that took him off the project: the birth of his son, Max. In his own words, he just couldn't be Peter Pan anymore, as the responsibilities of becoming a father completely changed his view on life, and he was no longer interested in telling that particular story. So Spielberg abandoned the project and for several years focused on directing films with much more serious topics, such as The Color Purple and Empire of the Sun, which dealt with the end of childhood innocence, quite literally the opposite of Peter Pan. Meanwhile, and completely unrelated to Spielberg's version, screenwriter James V. Hart was working on his own adaptation of Peter Pan. He'd actually been trying to bring the story to life since the early 80s, but could never quite figure out how to do an updated retelling.
Oh, please, please believe. If you believe, wherever you are, clap your hands and she'll hear you. Clap! Clap! Don't let T die! Clap!
However, in 1986, his family was having dinner one night when his 7-year-old son asked him a question. Did Peter Pan ever grow up? And when told no, he replied, well, what if he did? This led him to completely rewrite the script, becoming Hook, The Return of the Captain, a story of a new version of Peter Pan who flew away from Neverland, had a family, completely forgot about his past, and became a workaholic lawyer. But once his kids are stolen by Captain Hook, he must return to Neverland and rescue his children, and begins a journey to rediscover his past. Now it gets really messy as far as who had the rights to what and when and which studios and agents were involved at different points in time, but suffice it to say, this version of Peter Pan eventually wound up at TriStar Pictures. Hired to direct the feature was filmmaker Nick Castle, who had just come off of the success of The Last Starfighter. For the role of Captain Hook, Dustin Hoffman was once again signed on to play the iconic villain. For the role of Peter Pan, rumors began circulating once again about Michael Jackson's involvement, though once again this was quickly denied. However, the script was sent to actor Robin Williams, who is mostly known for his charismatic energy and comedic brilliance. But in recent years, he'd proven himself as a talented dramatic actor in films such as Dead Poets Society and Awakenings. This made him the perfect choice to play the role of Peter Banning, who goes through the emotional arc of a miserable adult to the childlike and mischievous Peter Pan.
Did you have any reservations in taking it? I mean, is this right for me?
I had many reservations. I mean, because I'm the one who did Popeye, and after going through that whole experience. And not that that was a bad movie. There's wonderful things about that. It just was a movie that didn't end with all the pizzazz that it should have.
But he was also very hesitant of doing yet another fanciful, big-budget adaptation of an iconic character, as the critical and box office failure of Popeye was still very fresh in the public's eye. However, he ultimately decided to take another risk and officially signed on to play the iconic character of Peter Pan.
He's got to make a jump to the eye. He's got to really hope it works. And he goes, eye, and it works. Okay, the eye holds.
Fast forward to just after filming wrapped on Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, which was made in part to make up for Temple of Doom. Again, it's a little messy, so to keep it simple, the screenplay for Hook the Return of the Captain was sent to Steven Spielberg by his former agent, who just so happened to run TriStar Pictures. Spielberg immediately fell in love with this new take on the classic story of Peter Pan, but there was just one problem. Hook already had a director. So in a bit of a controversial move, Spielberg wound up replacing director Nick Castle, who was given a 6-figure settlement and story credit. But in his defense, supposedly it was the studio's decision to take him off the film, not Spielberg's, due to creative differences with the actors.
Does he look up again?
He looks up a second time.
But that the call has to be there.
Oh yeah, I think you're right. Absolutely.
Let's get that.
At this point, the idea of making Hook into a musical was still very much part of the plan, and was initially envisioned as an epic 3-hour presentation in the same vein as Dr. Dolittle. So composer John Williams and lyricist Leslie Bricusse developed at least 7 original songs for musical numbers. However, this approach was ultimately abandoned, and only 2 songs would make it into the film as initially envisioned, although many would find their way into John Williams' instrumental score. The original screenplay by James V. Hart also went through quite a few revisions, such as fleshing out the character of Captain Hook. Another was Tinkerbell, in which the one and only Carrie Fisher was brought in to rewrite much of her comedic dialogue.
It's just Dumbo.
I know who it is.
I got him on loan from Disney.
Casting for this new version also saw the likes of Bob Hoskins as Smee, Julia Roberts as Tinkerbell, and Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter's son Jack. Well, almost. Prior to gaining notoriety on the comedy sitcom Growing Pains, the up-and-coming actor actually auditioned for the role, but lost out to Charlie Korsmo. Another actor who didn't get the part was Joseph Mazzello, as he was thought to be too young, but since Spielberg was very impressed with the actor's audition, he promised him a role in another film that was in pre-production.
I feel real responsible to the people who take chances on movies. So when somebody gives me more money than I've ever had to make a movie before, this is the most expensive film I've ever had my hands on, that's what got me nervous. I didn't want to disappoint anybody.
By July of 1990, pre-production was once again well underway on Steven Spielberg's Peter Pan adaptation, which was now simply titled Hook. However, even before shooting began, there was a lot riding on Hook's success, especially at a time when Hollywood was beginning to rethink its stance on high-cost blank check productions. In fact, many studios had actually agreed to lower spending after a series of underperforming big-budget star-filled blockbusters. The primary reason for Hook's massive budget were the incredibly lavish and intricate sets at Sony Pictures Studios. The biggest soundstage was home to the Jolly Roger set, which was one of the largest movie ships ever constructed in Hollywood history. There was also Pirate Town, which was built to house the over 300 extras playing Captain Hook's crew. The Lost Boys' Neverland Playground was another gigantic movie set, which featured the equally massive Neverland tree. The sets were so impressive and larger than life that many of Hollywood's biggest stars went out of their way to gain special passes for a sneak peek. But aside from the unprecedented scale of these sets, they also had a connection to a beloved Hollywood classic.
It wasn't strange. It didn't feel like a set. It felt like, this sounds like a cliche like home, but it felt very, very comfortable. And I had a great feeling walking in there. Number one, because it's also the place where they shot The Wizard of Oz.
The pirate ship is built smack dab in the center of Emerald City.
Filming began in February of 1991, and perhaps it was due to The Wizard of Oz having used the same soundstages 6 decades earlier, but many were predicting that Hook could be the Wizard of Oz of a new generation. And who could blame them? On paper, everything about the production of Hook did seem like a classic in the making. You have Hollywood's biggest director, award-winning actors, a literary classic as source material, and at the time, one of the most expensive movies ever produced.
Everything feels real good! Are you frightened of the impending uplift, Swishpan?
Not at all. It's that type of tension that makes acting so much fun.
However, while it seems like there were nothing but smiles on the production of Hook, there was one incident that soon found its way into the media tabloids involving Julia Roberts. Allegedly, she was known by the cast and crew as Tinkerhell, but this was more than likely a reference to a very particular incident, as opposed to the myth that she was some kind of tyrant on set. It's a bit of a long story, so I'll just summarize. Julia Roberts was engaged and set to marry actor Kiefer Sutherland, but then there were allegations of him cheating on her with a stripper, her cheating on him with his best friend, and the wedding was ultimately called off. This led to Julia Roberts being whisked away to Ireland by said friend, right in the middle of filming Hook. The situation got so bad that Spielberg allegedly threatened to fire her from the movie, with actresses Meg Ryan and Michelle Pfeiffer listed as possible replacements for reshoots. However, eventually Spielberg and Roberts were able to work things out, and she returned to finish the film.
It was an unfortunate time for us to work together, but I think that Julia is a really, really good actress.
Would you have any hesitation about working with her again?
This is a 60 Minutes question, isn't it?
Controversy aside, the enormous undertaking of Hook led to the initially budgeted 1-month shooting schedule to grow to over 2 months of shooting, and the initial $50 million budget to a staggering $100 million, or just over $400 million today. By the spring of 1991, filming was complete, and the countdown to the film's December premiere began. But while normally I'd save the discussion of cut scenes until the end, in this case, it's important to discuss it here.
I wanted to kill Peter Pan, but you did it for me, didn't you?
Allegedly, the initial cut of Hook ran well over 3 hours, some say even 4, as between the setup of the story to the film's climax, there were a lot of scenes focused on expanding the characters, from fleshing out the Lost Boys to scenes building on their reconnection to Peter, and Peter's own emotional journey discovering who he once was to them. There were also many scenes showcasing Captain Hook's ever-growing influence on Jack, essentially becoming the father he'd always wanted. This also showed just how manipulative Captain Hook could be, as he slowly turned him against the family and life he once had. Maggie's character also had scenes which expanded her presence in the film, in which she essentially becomes a motherly, Wendy-esque figure to Captain Hook's captives. But while these scenes greatly fleshed out the second act of the movie, more than likely due to pacing, they were ultimately cut from the final film.
McDonald's Hook Happy Meal, based on a new movie. There's Peter Pan, a mermaid that swims, Hook himself, or a Lost Boy squirter. One with each $1.99 hamburger Happy Meal you buy your kids.
Hasta vista, Hook.
When Hook was released in December of 1991, the movie opened at #1 at the box office and remained in that position for another 3 weeks. However, reviews for the Spielbergian blockbuster were mixed to very negative. Many criticized the film's slow pace, saying the only real thrills and heartfelt moments came after Peter Pan becomes Peter Pan, over an hour into the movie. Others felt the story simply lacked any real imagination and was an example of style over substance, with a poorly paced and uneventful second act. There were those who did see the film as a wonderful cinematic adventure. However, the overwhelmingly negative reviews drowned out those who sang praise for Spielberg's adaptation. But one thing everyone could agree upon were the incredible sets, thrilling musical score, visual effects, and the fantastic performances from Robin Williams and Dustin Hoffman. All told, Hook grossed just over $300 million worldwide, but with the film's $100 million budget, on top of the revenue percentages for Spielberg and the film's stars, the movie wound up with just a $40 to $50 million profit.
In Hook, a grown-up Peter Pan is able to fly again. They utilize the blue screen process with a mechanical flying rig and an elaborate combination of computer graphics to create these truly wondrous flying scenes.
It did, however, receive 5 Academy Award nominations, but with the stiff competition from the also effects-driven Terminator 2, Hook saw 0 wins. So despite early predictions that Hook could be the Wizard of Oz of a new generation, it was mostly seen as an expensive flop, an example of big-budget spending with mediocre results. Studios had pinned their hopes on Hook for justifying its blank-check big-budget productions, but the White Knight of Hollywood spending actually wound up being Terminator 2. The also $100 million movie became the highest-grossing film of 1991, as well as the third highest-grossing film of all time. However, Steven Spielberg wouldn't have to wait very long to reclaim his position as the king of the Hollywood blockbusters, as production soon began on a movie that would change cinema forever. Robin Williams wouldn't have to wait long either before giving life to one of the most iconic animated characters of all time.
I don't care what I am! I'm free! Offer void, we're prohibited by law.
In the years since, Spielberg has expressed his disappointment with the outcome of the movie, blaming himself for a lack of confidence in the second act. This is the reason I brought up the deleted scenes earlier, as I have to wonder if they could have helped audiences connect to the middle portion that so many deemed as uneventful and dull.
Let's have fun.
On the other hand, they might have just made the second act feel bloated or just too unfocused, which is more than likely the reason they were cut in the first place. But then there's Maggie, who without those scenes expanding her character arc and essentially becoming Wendy, had very little purpose in the final film. However, since only 11 of the supposed 30 to 40 deleted scenes have seen the light of day, it's difficult to say for certain.
The film should have been a musical. It was my first impulse to make it into a musical, and I absolutely chickened out at the last minute, and that was my mistake. It could have been a better movie as a musical.
Spielberg's other regret is not making Hook a musical as initially envisioned, which is interesting since the one complete song that did make it into the film was nominated for an Academy Award, but criminally the score was not. So at the end of the day, if you're like me and love Steven Spielberg's Hook despite its imperfections, here's to hoping that one day an extended cut is released, or at the very least the additional missing scenes to see what truly could have been.